Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the August 5th meeting of the Denver Citizen Oversight Board. I'll call this meeting to order as we have a quorum of board members present. Excited to go through our agenda today. We've got a pretty rich meeting planned, and Executive Director Armando Saldate will be joining us today. A lot happening in the public safety realm, so tons of questions that we've got for him, and I'm excited to engage with him on that process. Before we get too far, I'd like to get to a couple of board administrative items. So if board members have had a chance to review the board minutes from our last meeting, may I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Great.
Second.
Thanks. All in favor? Aye.
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 Any opposed? Great. Okay, the motion passes. So a couple of really exciting updates I have for board members and community members today. As of last night, the position for the new independent monitor has been posted publicly. So we're thrilled to get that out. As a reminder for folks, we will keep that position open until filled. And based on the advice of our recruiting partner, August is generally a pretty bad month for people applying for jobs with transition back to school and, you know, lots of things happening, just kind of based on the time of year. People tend to not apply for jobs in August. And so we hope that that's different. There's a lot of excitement about this role, but we will plan to keep it open until we've got it filled. And we may have an uptick in applications in the September timeframe. So we'll hope, but be realistic about that aspiration. We will be providing board members, screening committee members and council with some social media posts and things that you can share to get the word out. The position was also posted, oh shoot, now I put that away, but to a number of partner organizations that the board had identified. So let me just list them out so folks know. Do you have that list handy, Daniel? Here it is. Okay, here we go. Association of Inspector Generals, Colorado Bar Association, Government Jobs, International Municipal Lawyers Association, LinkedIn, National Association of Civilian Oversight, Law Enforcement, so NACOL, National Bar Association, National Black Prosecutors Association, National Forum of Black Public Administrators, and National Hispanic Bar Association. So I know we had some interest in making sure that the local associations were also hit up with this. So we'll make sure that that happens as well. But, probably by, Daniel, do you think the end of the day, you can get folks some things to share? Okay, great. And then, yeah, please spread the news far and wide. I've also been in touch with a few media outlets to highlight this potentially next week as part of some stories, just so we're really getting the word out. The one thing I'll highlight too about this process is Councilmember Torres was on our screening committee, but is taking the leadership of City Council later this year. And so Councilmember Gilmore is going to be on the screening committee instead. And I met with her and briefed her yesterday on the function and organization of the screening committee, and she's really excited to support this effort. So shouldn't be any gaps there, but we had planned to send out a press release and can do that later today as well, announcing that the position's posted. And we'll make the update to the council member role on the screening committee in that same announcement. So lots going on the hiring front. Really excited about that. Next, I wanted to highlight that the board is conducting our strategic planning efforts later this month. And we're scheduled to have a board meeting August 19th, but we're canceling that and instead using that time for the first of 2 strategic planning workshops. We've also moved our meeting with Chief Hazen, which was scheduled for that day, to be September 16th. And then the last reminder is that we have a quarterly public forum scheduled for August 23rd, and we'll be joined by Sheriff Diggins in that meeting. Any questions, comments, thoughts from board members on what I have just shared? Cool. Okay. So with that, Interim Monitor Crittenden, do you have any updates that you'd like to cover in our public meeting?
No, but I will have some stuff for the executive session.
Okay, great. Well, with that, I would like to welcome our guest today, Executive Director of Safety, Armando Saldate. Thanks for coming today. I know we had provided you with some questions in advance. Open to you in terms of if you'd like to work through those or just start off with comments and then we can get into dialogue. We're flexible.
Sure. Yeah, thank you and good morning to the board and to community that are on the call. Thank you for this opportunity to come visit with you all and answer your questions. Thank you for sending those questions over. I have reviewed them and hopefully we'll be able to answer all your questions as best I can. And then if there are more questions from community, I am happy to entertain those in the time that we have. And if there are some we do not get to, as always, I will either respond back in writing to you all so you all can communicate out to the community, or we could do it at another time and venue. So as you indicated, it has been a very busy time in the city and the Department of Safety with our departments, particularly police department. There was a incident that are the first part of the questions that you all had sent to me. This was the shooting that took place in Lodo, lower downtown, outside a venue named the Beer Hall, around the 2000 block of Larimer Street. That incident created a lot of attention and has been the subject of media and community attention as well. Obviously, it's a critical incident, and so our teams responded that night, and that I am also been involved, and from the notification that night to being closely involved. I want to just and I know the board's familiar with this process, but I also want to just let the community members know what the process is. And so which will, and just out of respect for the process and out of respect for the things that are going through, particularly criminal investigations, there are some questions or some details I may not be able to share at this point. And also in particular, and I want the community to know this, is ultimately I'm the final decider on discipline for the department and for our safety departments. So it would be premature for me to make findings at this point based on the facts that we have. I have not been presented all the facts nor the investigation. There have been statements taken by numerous people, witnesses, officers involved. And so there are those things that I have to respect in that timing of that process, due to the fact that I will be the ultimate decider on sustained discipline, on matters of those things, if there were to be policy violations and those matters. So I just wanted to give people some expectations around that, and just going into that, that's kind of the reasons why I would maybe refrain from doing some findings or my opinions or those sorts of things. And so that is where I'm at. I will explain the process as best we can and the facts that we have to date. And they will be very general facts. Like I said, there is much more detail. There is a significant criminal investigation that is ongoing. So let me take you to that night to try to give a timeline. And I think this will answer that first question that we all had. And the question was, despite the press conference that DPD had, there was still confusion about the facts, and there was a request for me to restate those facts. So this happened. The incident happened. It was about 1:35 in the morning. It was police officers are monitoring what we refer to as the out crowd. That is, folks in lower downtown and those familiar with lower downtown know that we have a number of nightlife venues. We have Coors Field. We have, if there's a concert, if there's a ball game, we have a number of bars, restaurants, those types of things, nightclubs, and 2 o'clock being the closing time for all those places. Around that 1:30-ish time, people start filing out of that. That's that crowd that comes. The Denver Police Department has put in for at least the past year or so that I know of, dating back to last summer after the pandemic. The pandemic changed things a little bit when things were closed down, but when things reopened, we have a plan, a tactical operation that takes place to shut down the streets, to have high visibility patrols. We have a command center there, which is a large RV police vehicle out there that is monitoring. We're supervision staff and tactical staff are in there monitoring the Halo camera footage from around the area to be able to deploy officers more efficiently, to help identify areas of choke points, to make sure the egress of the crowd is peaceful and free of obstruction and events. Unfortunately, when we have folks that are out, and I don't want to cast the crowd out as some bad crowd or anything. There are, I've been out to these events. I was actually out the weekend following this incident to monitor the activity. It is exciting for me to see, especially after all the lockdowns and things, and we were closed down as a city, as a country, the nightlife and all our venues full, and people, and lots of people enjoying our beautiful downtown and all that it has to offer. That is something that we all want and promote, from the city to the police department, and we all want it just to be a safe environment. Part of it, keeping it safe, is making sure the venues and everyone can leave the area once everything closed down in a peaceful manner. Sometimes when you introduce alcohol and you introduce large groups of folks and you introduce crowds, and especially at choke points, there is sometimes conflict. That conflict can sometimes result in physical confrontations, which we've seen on plenty of occasions. The night I was out, we saw plenty of fist fights, physical altercations between people leaving. Not to say everyone does it or that it's widespread, but it is something that we see, and that most people are there just to have a good time and leave peacefully. So officers then deploy to maintain the peace and to get these parties broken up, to make sure further violence does not occur. Another phenomenon which we are seeing in downtown and lower downtown at this out crowd is the prevalence of guns. Guns and gun violence associated with that. When you bring, alcohol, and you bring people in conflict and in confrontation, and if you have guns, that could end badly. And that is something that did happen, that happened this night, and it is something that we frequently, when I say we, the Denver Police Department frequently encounters folks with guns in lower downtown. That obviously heightens our security concerns and response. In fact, the night I went out there, the weekend after, there was folks that were identified gang members that were, guns were taken from them. I believe one of the firearms was stolen, and it was done without incident. And then I think even the following week there was more guns taken from individuals, including juveniles, out in this area. So on this night, a altercation took place in the 2000 block of Larimer, a physical fight among many subjects. That is also covered by Halo camera footage. Halo camera footage is the name for those cameras that you see around downtown and in other parts of our city that are monitored by folks, by the department, and are available to the department. And those are the feeds that we get inside that command vehicle I described. The Halo camera footage shows this fight. It's out in the street by a food truck. The crowd, as officers arrive to the area, they see one of the combatants. They go to contact one of the individual. He walks into a crowd onto closer to the beer hall. The officers attempt to kind of go around. They didn't follow him directly into the crowd at first, but kind of paralleled him. At some point, a gun was produced. It is a 10mm handgun that was produced by the subject. The officers then fired. There were 3 officers that fired their service handguns. One officer fired 4 times, one officer fired 2 times, and another officer fired a single round. The suspect was hit, as were others in the crowd. The suspect, from all indications and evidence now, did not fire a round. The officers were equipped with body-worn camera, and those are, and that is also part of the evidence and investigation. There, as you all know, and from the press and from the press conference and coverage, the rounds that were fired at the subject were also struck other folks in the crowd. These folks were identified, some on scene and some that self-transported to area hospitals at some time later. This was that no injuries were at the time were considered life-threatening, although there were folks that were in serious condition and transported. The subject that had the firearm or produced the firearm that was involved in the original altercation was identified, was treated and arrested. He has been treated in Denver Health Hospital for his gunshot wounds. And it is my understanding he is now in the medical ward of our Denver downtown jail. He is facing charges. I believe the DA has filed the charges. And he is, and that is one aspect of a criminal investigation that is ongoing. So that is a separate criminal investigation into the crimes that he is alleged to have committed. The other part of the criminal investigation that happens in all these officer-involved shootings, critical incidents, is a criminal investigation that takes place of the actions of the officers and what happened. So that night, so folks know that happened, immediate notifications are made to institute this process, which includes Denver Police Homicide Division, the Colorado Bureau of Investigations, and Colorado State Patrol. We have an MOU with them to do a joint investigation of these matters, to have outside eyes into this. They're also a participant and who came out that night and responded to the scene is the Denver District Attorney. A lot of times in these cases, it will be a chief deputy or someone high ranking, but in this case, the DA herself, Beth McCann, responded to the scene that night to begin monitoring the investigation and begin monitoring the interviews and all such things. There's also an important part of this, and Denver has really led the way in this type of oversight, is the oversight of the Office of Independent Monitor. So Gregg Crittenden, our interim independent monitor, and his team, who he has on call and standby for these types of events to respond, are immediately notified as well, so they can respond to the scene and begin their duties and active monitoring of the critical incident, to include monitoring of the investigation and the interviews as well of all involved parties. So that all took place that night. That night, there was also some instance of what was told to the press and what was not. And so I want to provide a little bit of background on how that took place. Our Chief of Patrol, Chief Ron Thomas, as he does in most situations, I don't think he ever sleeps because he always responds to these things. He responded to the scene. My understanding was that the Denver Police PIO team, public information team, had tweeted the incident, the details of or not the details, but just what was happening in the area of lower downtown. There were not press that were available at the time of the briefing or at the time that Chief Thomas was there. So a recorded statement was then done by our team of Chief Thomas giving a brief statement about what we knew to that point. And that was, and I see a hand up, so I'll pause, and I think that's Julia.
Thanks. I'm just wondering if Gregg or yourself can highlight sort of what's the standard process for investigating something like this, and
Sure.
you know who, maybe Gregg, if you can talk about sort of like what's the oversight process here, and you know if there's anything you can say about how well that's working or not working, that's great. Otherwise, just like what can the community expect in terms of who's receiving information when and making decisions when.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll defer to Gregg, and then whatever you would like me to fill in from there, I will then come back on.
Yeah, during the criminal investigation stage, which is where the case is right now, we get called out on the night of the incident. We're then allowed to listen to the interviews that Major Crimes is doing regarding the shooting. We're also allowed to listen to the interviews with the subject officers if they're done at a different date. And so we're able to watch and also ask questions. We're allowed to recommend questions to Major Crimes to ask questions to the witnesses or to the subject officers. More of the active monitoring role occurs actually when the IAB gets the case after the criminal investigation. And at that time, we're able to review the evidence that was collected by Major Crimes. We're able to have a more one-on-one discussion with internal affairs. And we're more involved in the administrative investigation than we actually are in the criminal investigation. So there's a lot of information during the criminal investigation that the OIM will not be privy to while it's being investigated on the criminal side of things. And that's the standard process.
Okay. And then I'm never quite sure when and why a third party, so, you know, we've got partners in this State Patrol and, you know, the DA's office, but like, when do each of those groups get called in to help independently review, and what are the, you know, is there like specific criteria, or is that just like, this feels like it's different than normal? Like, how do you decide who's the partner in the external review and, you know, when they come in?
I believe the result of the external review or external participation in this was the result of legislation that was passed some time ago. We then entered an MOU with those agencies that would have the capacity for this and expertise, and that MOU began when I took over from the role of executive director. That agreement and the roles and responsibilities were outlined in that agreement with my counterpart over at the state, Stan Hilke, the director of Department of Public Safety in Colorado, and State Patrol. So that is standard process. So it is not like we pick and choose when it's a critical incident like this. It's bound by our MOU that they get called out. They have a critical role. In fact, in the recent police shootings, I've gone out to them and I've been monitoring interviews where I'm like, I don't recognize that person, that detective, and it is actually Colorado Bureau of Investigation detective conducting interviews. So that is something that is a joint investigation to offer, I believe, objectivity to this and outside eyes into this. The ultimate decider and that outside entity on the criminal investigation is the district attorney in the district attorney's office. She is the ultimate decider on what charges are being filed in that process. That is not a police function or a function of the Department of Public Safety. So in this case, what the DA does is she then makes a public finding, which is a decision letter or a shoot letter, as sometimes they're referred to, where she will render her decision. She and her staff that have worked on the case and investigated the matter will render decisions about if the actions by the officers were just made the shoot justifiable or not, or where they meet the threshold for criminal charges or not. That is what then, and that is really the deciding factor on when we begin our administrative investigation, and they are very much separate. And one of the big things is when in a criminal investigation, like in any criminal investigation, officers are not compelled to give a statement. They have their rights, just Miranda implications and all those rights are also afforded to officers involved in these incidents. So that's something that takes place as well with the subject in this case that is under arrest. So that is the criminal portion of it. So, and then the evidentiary collection and all those follow criminal justice proceedings. The administrative part is much different. The administrative part, and as Gregg says, that's where the OIM has much more a direct oversight of that process. That is when we can compel people to make statements. So in the case, and not in this case because officers did give statements, but in the case of, let's say an officer did not give a statement in the criminal case, we can compel it. That law is referred to as Garrity. It's a US court decision in Garrity that gives employers the right to compel statements as a condition of employment. So we can then do that. We also then get into tactics and policy on a much more direct scale, as opposed to, violating a policy is not necessarily a criminal matter in a criminal case, but it is obviously under our jurisdiction in the administrative case. Tactics, policies, those sorts of things will then be under review and scrutiny by this office, and then that's when it then goes through the process that you all are more familiar with, that administrative process where Gregg, the monitor, is actively monitoring. There is then, once the investigation on the administrative side is concluded and it has been monitored and Gregg's team is satisfied that it is complete and thorough, it is then passed through to the conduct review side of the house. Conduct review then does a review and makes the findings, their recommendations for findings on whether there were policy violations or not. They also then, if there were policy violations, apply the levels of those violations to a discipline matrix. And that discipline matrix is in our discipline handbooks that are available on our websites, and then recommend what they think aggravating circumstances and mitigating circumstances are weighed, and they make a recommendation. At that time, the monitor as well is able to make a recommendation on discipline. And then, as I said, ultimately it will come to me in my office to make the final decision with that.
I see Gregg, you have your hand up. Do you want to respond to that at all?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Armando was saying, that after the administrative investigation has occurred and the OIM's okay with the case moving forward, I don't know if you'd mentioned that it goes to for officer involved shootings, it goes to a use of force review board. And that's the people that are on the OIM is able to be present, but we're not voting members. But there's different people in the department that are on this board. There's a member that's not with the department and law enforcement that's on the board, and they make a finding as to whether or not the shooting is in policy or out of policy, or if it needs to go to a tactics review board, or if people should consider it for commendations. And so then after the use of force review board, if there's an agreement that, then it's forwarded to the chief of police. And then if the chief and the OIM agree in regards to I guess there being no policy violations, then the case is closed and no further administrative action is taken. However, if one of the groups, either myself that representing the OIM or the use of force board or the chief, if anyone has concerns that there is a potential policy violation, it will then go to the CRO. Well, I think that's still, if we can ask that it go to the CRO for further review, and then the CRO would then do a analysis as to whether or not something is in policy or not. It would then go to the chief for the chief's thoughts on that and his recommendations, and then it would go to Armando for a final decision. And in between there, the OIM would also be able to give input as to whether or not we thought shooting was in policy. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, that is absolutely right, Greg, and I'm glad you brought that up. I also have, I believe, a tactical review board will also review tactics here in this particular instance as well. Similarly, like what Greg, the process Greg just decided, in addition to the use of force board.
So sort of summarizing a very long process, there's a chunk of time spent on the question of, did you commit a crime in firing your weapon? And then that's where the DA and our external partners with State Patrol are supporting investigation. And then once that completes, or parallel to that, there's a question of, did you do something that was contrary to the standards and expectations of your job? And then if that's true, what disciplinary actions need to be taken as a result?
Yeah.
I think for the public's purpose too, it's worth noting, just how many people have a role in that, and how many different groups within the Department of Safety have some sort of say or influence in the process. I think for the board's point of view, it's often a challenge of sort of how diffuse the decision making is in this process, because lots of different boards, groups, people are weighing in. And so, I think, at least for me, it gives me comfort to know at the end of the day, there is a clear decision maker, but it doesn't always feel like that when we sort of proceed through these processes. I know there were a couple of other questions related to this, and then Stefan, I'd like to get to your question. The first is, based on that same statutory update, state statute update, body-worn camera footage is to be released within 21 days of an officer-involved shooting. I can't remember the exact date of that shooting, but do you have an estimation of when that will be released to the public?
Yes, I do. I believe I just had it. It's on the 16th. So first, the question is, are we going to release in compliance with the law? Absolutely. Always will, always do. Now, how that process is since this is in the DA's hands, the DA has an opportunity to solicit the court or make a plea to the court if they do not want to release the video for some reason, for their criminal investigation purposes. It has been indicated to me that the DA is not going to oppose the release or object to the release of the video within this timeline mandated by the statute. The other part that gets to weigh in on this is the defense, the criminal defense attorney for the subject. If the criminal defense attorney for the subject somehow objects, they have the opportunity to also object to that release. And then it is subject to the decision by the judge. So it is my understanding as of yesterday afternoon that we have not heard a final decision from the defense attorney, and it is purely within their rights to object or to allow this to be released. And then if that person is to object, then it would be subject to a hearing by a judge, and then the judge would rule on that release. If they do not object, then we will release within those timelines and constraints. The timelines are a little tricky because the job or the I believe statute is about from the time of the shooting. I believe the judge has given a time of when that clock started. So the judge is on the clock for that. So whatever is in compliance of what the judge is telling us is what we will comply with. We are doing it. We are preparing as if we are releasing. That person that does those releases is someone that works within the Department of Safety. And she is our custodian of records, and so operates under my authority, and the authority I've given to her is we will obviously comply with the timelines as dictated in this process by statute and by the judge.
That's great. 2 follow-up questions, and then I'll turn it over to Stefan. Has the body-worn camera footage been released to the Office of the Independent Monitor, and was that done in a timely fashion?
So the body-worn camera in this incident, so it's my understanding that there was And I appreciate this being raised to my attention, and me being able to speak with the monitor about this. And I've had my staff follow up with Gregg on this issue. Is have they been allowed to see it? Have they been allowed to do that? And my understanding is they have been allowed to see it. They have viewed it. They viewed the Halo footage as well. However, there is a process, I believe, where I think Gregg described that process, where the criminal investigative evidence and stuff is kind of kept in a separate kind of avenue. And Gregg, please, if I'm not getting this right, please weigh in on this. And then once that administrative process begins, then that is when it is uploaded into our administrative case management system, IA Pro. And that is when it is open. And as the monitor has access to IA Pro, as does Daniel from the board. So that is my understanding of this. And I know that Mary Dulackey's followed up with you, Gregg, on that. Did I get that right? I want to make sure, especially for transparency on that.
Yeah, there isn't necessarily like a set process. I know sometimes we've received body worn camera footage through a shared database that we're able to access body worn cameras from officer involved shootings. Sometimes we get them within the week of the shooting. The majority of the time we get them after the criminal investigation has been completed. So it's not consistently the same time and when body worn camera and Halo video is released to us for us to review it at our own speed and as many times as we like. So we haven't received anything yet on this one. We have received some on others. We were able to observe, Internal Affairs did allow us to watch some of the body worn camera and some of the Halo footage before we were able to observe the interviews, which Major Crimes did. But as for, like a consistent set process, there isn't necessarily that, but the majority of the time, when looking back, generally the body worn camera is released for our viewing after the criminal investigation, but just not always. Sometimes we get it sooner.
Yeah, and Julia, Board, Gregg, if this is something, since this doesn't seem to be a consistent practice and we need to standardize and come to a kind of a standard policy and practice, I'm more than willing to get to the table. And if this issue has brought that out on standardizing, let's please get together with all the people that need to be involved in these decisions. I don't know if in the past this has been impacted by maybe DA advice as well. So I say let's get through this and let's try to sit down and try to establish policy here so that we can make sure there is consistency.
Yeah, in my mind, inconsistency breeds distrust. So
Right.
Having at least clarity on who should get access when is a really good idea. The last question I'll ask and then turn it over is, do we believe we've found all of the innocent bystanders who were shot by DPD as part of this incident?
I do believe so, yes. I do not know of any other, question or if there is any more victims here. I have not heard any details that would indicate there are any more. So yes, I believe so.
Stefan, I want to ask you.
Yeah. You all have actually answered most of my questions in the past few minutes, but I did want to clarify, and Julie, I thought that was important clarification for the community in that the fact that the administrative investigation with respect to potential disciplinary proceedings against the officers involved does not really commence until the criminal investigation is complete, and there is no particular timeline for that criminal investigation to be completed, so that the DA will determine one way or another whether the shooting was justifiable. And I think that's been clarified. I do have a question though. What, if anything, does OIM and IAB do while the criminal investigation is proceeding? And then secondly, will the Halo footage also be released, assuming there's no issues with the the defense attorney or the judge, will the halo footage also be released at the same time that the body worn camera footage will be released?
Yeah, to that question, is my understanding, yes, it will be. We are preparing to do that release in coordination with the law. So I do believe so. If that changes anyhow, or someone tells me I'm wrong, I will let you know. But I do believe that will. And to the question of what is IAB doing and what is the OIM doing in response to this is, and I think right now, you know, they do gather evidence. They are putting those things together, going through the statements. They are preparing for the administrative part of this investigation. But really, we cannot do any real proactive work as in interviews or administrative interviews until that criminal investigation and decision is made on that, and that charging decision is made.
And right now, Stefan, yeah, we're just waiting for information and body worn camera and halo footage. And then we'll be able to kind of start preparing once the administrative part starts. But right now we're waiting for the information.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that's a critical point because the public is obviously waiting and wanting additional information about all of this, including the footage. And it's important for the public to know that really nothing happens on the administrative side until the DA's office completes its criminal investigation.
Just a follow-up question on that. Is that really a best practice to do these sequentially as opposed to in parallel? I just sort of wonder, you know, in the case of Breonna Taylor, right, officers were just charged 2.5 years after her death. And then if you go into an administrative process, it's like, that's a long time ago for people to remember facts. And it feels like, you know, potentially hard to hold people accountable from a standards of their job standpoint so many years later. So I just wonder, like, is there any reason we have to do these things sequentially versus in parallel?
So really great question, Julia. And I've gotten a lot of experience in this in my former roles and teams. I've actually done criminal investigations on police, and it is really a case-by-case basis on how you can run things in parallel versus and it really depends, I think, on the severity of the crime that is taking place and the crime that is being investigated. What the administrative process really works hard to do is to not somehow taint a criminal prosecution or somehow interfere in a criminal prosecution, particularly around that what I talked to you all about in that compelled statements, Garrity statements. Compelled statements cannot be utilized in criminal prosecutions unless they are to somehow, if someone goes up on the stand and says something totally different than what they said in a compelled statement, it could possibly be introduced as impeachment evidence. So this is something that is really a delicate balance. And there are cases where there is parallel administrative matters to parallel criminal matters. I've seen some where, like, let's say an officer got a DUI and that they have a criminal investigation. And if the investigators can imagine, like, oh, you know what, or we speak to that prosecutor of that DUI and they say, go forward, we have the evidence we need, you're not going to impact us. There will be an administrative parallel investigation. I don't know if Gregg's had any experience with this where he's seen these kind of operate in parallel. I have in my former experience, but I've always seen that in critical incidents like an officer involved shooting, serious criminal potential, that there is always a deference to the criminal case, which then puts it sequential.
Thanks. And in the meantime, while, you know, all of this is proceeding, are the officers on administrative leave or are they back, you know, working shifts? How does that work?
So yeah, so the officers are when this happens, the officers are on administrative leave. There is a process. There's a lot of, you know, there's a process here that the Denver Police Department has in place, and there's also a reintegration process to get someone back in the line of duty if that is what we decide here to do. But at this process, they are in that integration process. I am not, I apologize, I'm not fully, I know it's a pretty significant one. I know The DPD does a lot with them, including taking them back to the training academy. I would really defer to police to give you what that is step by step, but there is a process for that.
Okay, and then said another way, so if it took 2 years to charge them, they would be paid their full salary while not working on administrative leave, waiting for this to.
Yeah, and there would also be a potential that they go back to duty, that they could go back to duty pending the outcome of this case, or pending, whatever decisions are made.
Although I want to, oh, sorry, Armando, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead, sir.
I wanted to clarify the situation with the Breonna Taylor case. Those were federal charges that were brought 2+ years later, federal civil rights charges. The locals, I believe, declined prosecution much more quickly, and then the Fed stepped in. So that's a very interesting dynamic as to whether, and I'm not an expert in in the law in that state, but I mean, it's an interesting dynamic as to whether I don't know the administrative proceedings there versus whether they would be halted while a federal investigation is going on. Typically, that may not be the case. When I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles, my office, after the officers were acquitted stateside, the officers who were in the Rodney King incident were acquitted stateside, then the federal investigation transpired. So I just don't know where in that process. It could be that the administrative proceeding moves forward after the local prosecutors decide perhaps not to bring charges, and then the federal investigation may take a while after that.
Yeah, and in that case, I don't know the details of their process like you, Stefan, but I have obviously followed the case closely in the news of the officers being charged federally. That could also be a federal civil rights case, or federal violations can also be criminal. And as we saw in the George Floyd with Officer Chauvin, and those officers that were involved in that murder were also subject to federal charges as well. And so that would also be a deferment to, if the federal authorities were to contact us in any matter and saying they're investigating, we would then have to coordinate that. And we have in the past, there have been federal matters that the monitor knows about and things. And so we would have to defer to any administrative proceedings we're doing to what their process is.
Okay, thanks, that's very helpful. And not to take us too far off track here, but the questions from other board members. And while you may be thinking about questions, a couple of other community questions. Okay, there was a question about what produced a weapon means. What does it mean that the suspect in the downtown shooting produced a firearm?
So at some point during the encounter, it has been relayed, and from what I've seen, and the suspect or subject in this case had a hoodie on. There was a front pocket to the hoodie, and the handgun was removed by the subject from that pocket so that's what I meant by produce.
Okay.
Can you clarify the total number of people, sorry, Julia, the number of bystanders that you are aware that were shot by police during this incident?
I believe it was 6. Let me double check on that. I believe it was 6. But I can double check as we're doing this. So look at my notes. 3 adult males and 3 adult females. Yes, 6.
Thank you.
Okay, and then another question, which is sort of in the follow-up of the dialogue we were just having. When people are saying completing the criminal investigation, does that mean into the officer's criminality or into the alleged incident that started the indiscriminate shooting by police?
The officer's criminality. So we do not need for the criminal investigation of the subject's alleged crimes to be completed for the administrative investigations for the officer's actions to take place. So that would be the culmination of what DA McCann's decision is on charging. And let's say she charges. I mean, then we would have a decision to make on do we wait for the conclusion of those proceedings, or do we wait for, and so there will then be discussion around that, a charging decision as well.
Okay, thank you. There are a few questions that sort of surround, like, what's the context in which it's an appropriate time for an officer to fire a weapon? So what are things the community might want to know about, sort of best practices?
Yeah, this is definitely to the subject and to the decision on whether these were justified, this was a justified shooting or the firing of every round that they did. Obviously, when you are making a life or death decision, you have to make a decision based on the preservation of life, or you yourself think that you're in fear for your life or for the fear of someone else's life, would then be one of those decision factors for you to then decide when to use your weapon in a deadly force encounter. I can't get into the specific details on this because, like I said, that's the question here, right? Were they justified in every round that they fired, that they were justified in shooting, that they did have that thought process in their mind? So, but that is typically the notion. And then you also have to make a decision based on your backdrop, your location, do you think it would jeopardize others? Those types of decisions are all factored in that you have to make into a very split-second decision as you're in this encounter.
Okay, another question that we've gone through a few times, but I'll ask it again is, does the Office of the Independent Monitor have full access to the systems of record for the police department in terms of evidence and body-worn cameras, and can they access that information anytime?
So I don't know that they have full access to the systems of record. That would include, I mean, that statement would include that they would have unimpeded access to police records systems that aren't cases that involve investigations under their purview. Also, with the body-worn camera system, I know there's been a lot of discussion around what that access is to the database system that stores body-worn camera evidence and digital evidence is called evidence.com. I know that there has been a lot of discussion back and forth as to what that access is. As I understand it now, they have the same access to evidence.com as our district attorney and our city attorney's office. However, is it unfettered? They have access to every video. I do not believe that's it. I believe there was some question as to confidentiality in cases where they shouldn't have access to those. Some examples that were given to me is like a child sex crime type incident or things like that. So I know that there's been a lot of discussion. I would like to have Gregg weigh in case I somehow misstated that, but that is my understanding. And I do know that there is still debate in that regards as to the nature of that access.
Yeah, there are videos being shared with us on evidence.com on the sheriff's side of things. We haven't been shared any videos on evidence.com from the police department yet. So the way we're able to access body-worn camera videos and Halo videos from the police department is when they upload it into the shared database, the iPro database, on the specific cases that we're reviewing. And so once they've uploaded the videos on those cases, then we're able to watch them in those particular cases.
Thanks. So certainly something for us to continue to work on there. Stefan, go ahead.
Yeah, Armando, when you were describing sort of the criteria that's used to determine whether there's a justifiable use of force by the police in shooting, you were talking about, reasonable likelihood of fear that the suspect could, injure or harm the officers or those around him. Can you though clarify this a little? I mean, is that the sole standard? I mean, here we have a situation where there is a huge number of people in a crowd where it turned out to be there was a high likelihood that others could be injured. Isn't there something in the standard as well in determining whether to use an officer should use his or her firearm as to whether there's a reasonable likelihood that it could injure others, even though he's trying that the focus is on the suspect? Can you address that?
Yeah, definitely. That is something, and that is, and not specifically speaking about this incident, that is something that has to be factored in. Ultimately, like I said, the preservation of life is your ultimate factor, right? If especially someone that may be an innocent bystander, or folks that may be in your own life, that has to be weighed versus the danger of maybe jeopardizing others by the shot that you take. So yes, that is also part of the calculus. It's a very like I said, immediate but complex thing that you have to run through your mind when you make the decision to pull the trigger.
Yeah.
So perhaps said another way, bullets are very powerful, and even if you're aiming at someone, that bullet could go through that person and hit something on the other side of them. And so you want to be careful about what's behind the person you're shooting at as well.
Absolutely.
Okay. Any other? Yeah, go ahead, Terrence.
Director, outside of the academy, I know there's like a shoot house at the academy, shoot, don't shoot, and we've talked about going out there. Is there additional training outside the flat range and qualifications that officers have to go through on a regular basis to deal with these dynamic situations where you have shoot, don't shoot, and that happens very quickly? And how often do they have to go through that additional training?
Yeah, so the training is something that is key. Having been a police officer for a long time, your training, your skills and training are things that can, without practice, without that testing of your skills, can deteriorate. So the Denver Police Department does do training in regards to not only just shooting at flat targets as you described it. They also do simulated training, which is, as you all are probably familiar with, which is like video simulator training, where they are outfitted with a let's say a firearm, but it's not a real firearm, but it is a firearm-like thing that you engage with a video screen in scenarios, and really comes up with shoot, don't shoot scenarios. And so you play the part, you encounter a scenario, the video comes up, it's a big video screen of telling you kind of all kinds of scenarios. And as part of your training and these are pass fail kind of scenarios, you go through a series of interactions and scenarios, and they are in cases shoot, don't shoot, and you give verbal commands, you do all those things, and then you're evaluated and pass fail on those. And that is part of their training. We are also working currently on making our training, and our Denver police officers already receive more training than is required by our Colorado Post Board. But we are trying to, and Chief Hazen is also working hard to increase those hours of training for especially use of force events.
Good, Karen.
Director, in the process of considering whether or not a shot taken is justified, are the number of innocent bystanders hit in that incident considered, and whether or not a shot taken is justified?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. This case will be, every piece of evidence and outcome will be weighed by us as we review what were the decisions of and the decisions to fire in any case, and then what was the outcome of those bullets, right? And what was the intended outcome for what versus what happened is also subject to much scrutiny and will be part of the decision-making process here.
So taking the discussion a little further with an example, if there is a shot taken by an officer and it misses the intended suspect and hits and kills an innocent bystander, does that consideration change because of the fatality?
Well, obviously, a fatality would introduce, yeah, a lot of scrutiny, but in any time an officer fires, that is all scrutinized. And just to make a judgment on those facts, you would also have to understand what happened, right? All the other things, why they missed, all sorts of things. So, but yeah, definitely a fatality, or whether someone was just hit and not injured, or it could have been a superficial injury, would definitely also be something that is subject to. But obviously, the level of criminal punishment potential if someone dies is much more than if someone is just injured superficially.
Would you consider a shooting analogous to a chase where, the general rule is that the police department does not give chase in a vehicle-related situation because of the possibility of danger to innocent bystanders?
That's really be hard to make it analogous. There are some similarities, but in the case of a shooting, and as a difference between a car, a chase, is that immediate feeling that the officer may be under danger, right? Chasing a car that's speeding away from you doesn't create immediate danger for that officer's life. When an officer is encountering someone with a gun, that is a much different scenario where they may be in fear for their life. So I can't make a comparison for that to a car chase.
Okay.
Other board member questions? I'm seeing some community questions, and perhaps it's from media on the meeting today, but there's a question about who was invited to the press conference after the shooting. And it looks like a few media outlets were not contacted. Can you just speak to sort of what's the protocol for letting people know there's a press conference and ensuring that the media is appropriately invited?
Yeah, so that has been much scrutinized and subject to criticism, and I am trying to determine what that process is. My understanding is the police department did the process that they've done in previous incidents like this, notified folks via, I believe it was via social media. I don't think it was a direct press release or press outcome. I do not know exactly how that took place in this particular scenario. My understanding was it wasn't a deviation from any sort of previous encounter. I think it was with the hour of the day that there was not, direct response to the scene. I think this, when the information started going out, I think we were talking about 3 in the morning, 3:30, maybe 4 in the morning. It was still evolving. So yeah, that is something that we are discussing, and how we make that out and how we make the proper notifications to make sure or ensure that media is on the scene. This was by no means an intentional act to not have media there. It was my understanding that it was just the standard how they always have done these. And if there is a change that is needed to make sure that media are notified, particularly taking in the hour of day, or giving them an opportunity, or maybe I've even discussed with the potential of, let's wait till 7 in the morning as opposed to 4 in the morning to get a more well-rounded availability. We are always willing to do that. I believe that the DPD acted here in good faith of how they had always done it, like with the response and making Chief Thomas, available at the scene. I know it didn't meet the expectations of folks from the media, and there's some consternation about that, but we are willing to be that. That was never the intention of not having media there. Because typically Chief Thomas is there in front of media at these. I've been there at the events when he's been there, and media have been there. So I don't know if I can definitely tell you that people were not intentionally excluded from that notification, but there is potential to make better notification, or to know, especially how this rolled out, that we need to be more deliberate to make sure that there is a better notice to media to give them an opportunity to be present at that statement.
If board members don't have any other questions, I'll close this out with one more and close out this portion of our meeting. So you know, I'm very interested in the fact that we didn't exactly know at first who was shot. And I just wonder if you can speak to like, what's the protocol, what's the defined protocol for understanding who victims are or who has been shot in a police involved shooting? How do we, you know, make sure people's wounds are being treated and, you know, we're taking care of people who you know, may be dying? Like what happens then? So, you know, weapons are discharged. You know, there's people bleeding on the scene. Those people weren't really part of the discussion with this individual. So like, you know, what should happen in that case?
So absolutely, at any critical incident, the police supervision, police first responders, one of the principal functions that they have is treating and making sure those that are injured are getting the effective treatment. And that may be direct treatment of officers, you know, putting on gloves, administering care to wounds. But the real thing is to get ambulatory care there, making sure our emergency medical response system is notified, fire department, Denver Health paramedics, and that was done in this case. However, this case was chaotic. It did produce chaos, and people fled the scene, including those that had been injured, and they self-transported to the hospital, which made it different. And they didn't all just self-transport to Denver Health down the street. Some went to, I believe, 2 other hospitals. And so, yeah, there was definitely confusion and some that isn't how we typically have a scene. Typically, if someone's injured at a scene, they remain at the scene, paramedics, and we secure the scene, and folks and paramedics, and then detectives and investigators can contact them, follow them to the hospital. All those things typically take place. That did not happen here. We had people that fled the scene, obviously, with gunshots and a big crowd. That is why we have the folks there. We understand this could be a result of something like that, and that's really what happened in this case. There were I believe those that that remained on scene were treated, and that there was a proper response from our emergency medical response system in getting there quickly. But the fact that folks transported stuff did add a level of confusion here.
Okay, and so you know, I hear gunshots, I run away because that seems like a place I don't want to be. Turns out I get shot and I sort of go take care of myself. And then the officers on the scene, you know, I sort of think about that yellow tape. Like, do they immediately stand up, put the yellow tape around, and they sort of look around like, where are the bullets? Where are the guns? Where are the like, you know, sort of what's the action that should be taken in that circumstance?
Yeah, absolutely. That is, and that yellow tape is a critical part of it, is recognizing, especially for those initial supervisors that respond to the scene, is coordinating off the potential crime scene for evidence and evidentiary purposes, and to make sure that it is controlled for a crime scene and for the evidentiary purposes of a crime scene. In the case of someone then transporting to, let's say, Denver Health Hospital here, then when they arrive there, obviously there are folks there, and police will respond to shooting victims at the hospital to determine where there was the location of the shooting, and to then collect evidence there at the scene, whether that is bloody clothes, bloody evidence, you know, the bullet fragment that may be recovered during this. Those are things that then that becomes the scene as well, of that the car that they were transported in, if there's blood and things of that, could become part of the evidentiary portion of the scene as well.
And police are trained to do that, right? You're
Yes.
sort of like coming out of the fog of a thing happening, and they're
Yep.
trained to say, okay, now we have to do this other process, which is sort of securing the scene.
Yeah, and then in the case of an officer involved shooting, you're also trained additionally into how do we handle the officers that have been involved in their shooting. There is a segregation of them. There is an officer to stand by them, or a sergeant to stand by them, because they then have to be, they are, you know, treated, you know, with the same sort of care. You know, we have to, you know, they aren't the ones that unload their guns. We have crime scene technicians that do that. We account for all their ammunition. All those things are very, and that is also part of training and how we handle the officers that were actually involved in the shooting.
Okay, that's very helpful. I'm reminded of one more community question that came in advance, so I'll go through that and then I'll close this out. Since that time, there's been a ban or some sort of new rule about food trucks in the downtown area. And I understand that the food truck owners are sort of upset about that, and maybe community members who are hungry coming out of bars are upset about that. Can you talk a little bit about the decision there and where that is?
Yeah, so that was a citywide decision. We talked about it, and this was something that had been talked about prior to even the events here. As I described early on when I was describing just what we do out at Lodo as part of our security plan, so we have a safe ingress and egress of folks, especially leaving bars. This has always been a problem, particularly those food trucks that are parked right outside of a venue, right outside of an exit, which may be good business for them, but it does create those congestion points and choke points where we have seen conflict arise, altercations, and then gunshots. In this instance, that was something that, and I saw it firsthand when I was out there. I saw how they served as choke points, how people congregated, and then you saw a fight. And then in some cases, it was very limited egress. In one case that I saw, the exit for the crowd and to where the food truck was parked was a little less than 10 feet. And we're talking about hundreds of people now filing out of a place. So it does create a hazard. And so we worked with, police, our internal partners in Dottie that, also, to administer the parking there, our excise and license team about the licensing and permitting of those things. We took into affair that there are places already in downtown that forbid food trucks at the Central Business District area. We talked about what we could do to mitigate that. And a lot of it is not putting them out of business, saying you got to close down. A lot of it is offering them a place to move, to take away those choke points, move out of that immediate exit area of that. And I believe 9 or so food trucks were contacted in this case. 2 took up the city on their offer and did relocate to a location just outside this immediate egress area. Some have not. I do understand it creates a impact on their business, and that is not what our intention is. Like I said, we all love when we see a vibrant and activated downtown with a lot of people, but we also cannot have that on the heels of safety concerns. And the safety here that it posed, especially in those ones that would be serving right outside an exit of a bar, was something that we had to weigh in making this policy.
So with that, I'll close out this part of the meeting. I know there are a number of questions in the Q&A that the community members have provided us. So we'll take those out of chat, and then Director Saldate will send those over to you in follow-up
Sure.
for the ones that you can answer. We'll hope for a response there.
Sure. And you had other questions we did not get to, and I'm sorry. I'm glad we spent the time on this issue, but I will have those prepared. I just have them in note form for me now, but I will get those prepared with Elisa's help, and then we'll get those over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you, community members, for your question and participation on the call today. With that, I'd like for a motion to adjourn to executive session so that we may actually talk about the in-process investigation here, which we can only do in that type of session.
So moved.
Great. Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, thank you so much. And this concludes the meeting today.
Thank you, board, and thank you, community, for the time.